In 1872, a young man set out on foot on a 500-mile journey across the state of Virginia.
Success is to be measured, not so much by the position that one has reached in life, as by the obstacles which he has overcome. This quote by the great Booker T. Washington perfectly sums up his own life.
He thought that it was best for African Americans to gain an industrial education and ideally translate that into land ownership, business ownership, and build up institutions of their own.
Join us as we dive into the life of one of the most impactful men in not only Black history, but American history. We will discover how someone born into the horrors of slavery ended up building universities, leading economic advancements, and embodied Black power before the phrase even existed. Click those join, like, and share buttons. Now, follow us to the farmlands of Virginia. Born a slave. April 5th, 1856. Booker T. Washington was born on a plantation in Franklin County, Virginia. Washington was born to an enslaved mother, Jane, who worked as a cook. His father, a white man from a neighboring plantation, was absent and never involved in Booker's life. Even as a child, he was thrust into the back-breaking forced labor of slavery. Just like all the other children on the plantation, Booker learned how to perform menial tasks like carrying water to men in the fields, feeding livestock, and carrying laundry. He worked long hours through the grueling summers, and they didn't stop in the shivering winters. In his book, Up From Slavery, Washington details the frustrations of not being educated. Like most slaves, he was denied proper education, as it was mostly forbidden to educate slaves. Many owners believed an educated slave is an uncontrollable slave. As a child, he dreamed of being able to read and write. That frustration, along with having to sleep in cramped living conditions with his mother and other siblings, would be the catalyst that sparked his relentless pursuits later in life. The Civil War ended in 1865, when Washington was about 9 years old. He would recall a great sense of joy and fear as the Emancipation Proclamation was read, signaling the end of slavery. His family, like many enslaved, had known no other life than backbreaking work and life on a plantation. They had to learn what freedom really was. After the war, the Washingtons moved to Malden, West Virginia, where his stepfather found work. And even though they were no longer enslaved, they still lived in poverty, and racism still made things difficult for Black people. To help out, young Booker worked in the salt and coal mines alongside his stepfather. However, hope came in the form of school. Even though he was still involved in backbreaking labor, he was able to attend school in West Virginia. He would get up as early as 4 a.m. to finish his work duties before attending school. Booker T. Washington's commitment to education and philosophy of self-reliance were formed during these years. From janitor to university founder. Booker T. Washington would watch white children attend schools. He would watch white children leaving schoolhouses and yearn for an opportunity to learn. When his family moved to Malden, he found what he was looking for. A Black local teacher began offering evening classes for the formerly enslaved. Washington jumped at this opportunity with the support of his mother. His mother bought him a blue-blacked speller. A blue-blacked speller was first introduced in 1783 and used to teach children how to read and spell. It was something Frederick Douglass used during his self-educating process. Washington would read his blue-backed speller as often as he could, which included during breaks at work and throughout the night. After a few years, a proper school for Black children opened up nearby. This excited young Booker, but his stepfather resisted, claiming Booker needed to continue to help provide for the family. So in order to go to school, Booker T. Washington would wake up at 4 a.m., work the mines, then head to Tinkersville School. That desire to seek out education, no matter the cost, was undeniable. While working the mines, Washington overheard two men talking about college. Well, it wasn't a college yet. The two men were talking about a place where African Americans were taught practical skills like agriculture and industrial, as well as formal education. This place was called the Hampton Normal and Agricultural Institute. Today, it's simply known as Hampton University. After hearing that conversation, at just the age of 16, Booker T. Washington set out on a 500-mile journey to Hampton, Virginia, determined to seek out more education. He arrived at the admissions office dirty and exhausted from his trek, and was almost immediately turned away. The head teacher told him if he wanted to be admitted, he must prove his worth to the institute. In order to prove it, he was handed a broom and tasked with cleaning every room. Washington cleaned every room so well and with great detail that he impressed the head teacher and was granted admission. From 1872 to 1875, he did work in the classrooms and earned his way by working as a janitor. Booker T. Washington found education heaven at the institute. Not only did he develop his reading, writing, spelling, and math skills, but he developed tools in agriculture and mechanics. The Hampton Institute was founded by General Samuel Chapman Armstrong. General Armstrong's philosophy of combining traditional education with practical skills would be something Booker would incorporate into his own evolving philosophy. General Armstrong would become a great influence and inspired Booker's ideas about education and self-reliance. When he graduated in 1875, Washington would take the lessons he learned from General Armstrong and the Hampton Institute and bring those lessons back to the black folk of Malden, West Virginia. It was here that he began teaching his ideas of self-reliance, doing for self, and the value of education to the formerly enslaved. He would carry on his teachings, working at various schools until 1881. At just the age of 25, he was offered the head principal position of a newly founded school in Tuskegee, Alabama. This school would become the Tuskegee Normal and Industrial Institute, better known as Tuskegee University. Do you love this type of content? Consider clicking that join button and becoming an exclusive member. Your support can go a long way in helping us continue to empower future generations through education. Cast down your bucket. For the next 15 years, Washington laid down the groundwork that would cement his legacy and outline the game plan he would use to share his philosophies with the nation. Under Booker T. Washington's leadership, Tuskegee became a model for other schools and played a key role in the education of not only black people in the South, but for black institutions across the country. His learn by doing philosophy at Tuskegee led students to become builders of their dreams. Literally, because Tuskegee was brand new, incoming students had to build their classrooms, dormitories, and facilities. This set the foundation of being responsible for your own development, which led to the students at Tuskegee to become some of the most productive in the country. During this time, Washington himself developed new skills to serve his school, fundraising, and networking. To help with the expansion of Tuskegee, Washington formed relationships and gained the funding of American businessmen like Andrew Carnegie and Julius Rosenwald. Their financial support proved vital, and he was able to form relationships with these men that he would later use to help build other black institutions. Fun fact: between 1882 and 1893, he went on to be married 3 times. Washington married his first wife, Fanny, and together they had a daughter, Portia. Unfortunately, Fanny died just 2 years later. He would marry for a second time in 1885 to Olivia A. Davidson. She was a fellow educator and would be someone he leaned on as he grew the institution. Together, they had 2 sons, Booker Jr. and Ernest David. Tragically, she died too in 1889. Washington would marry his 3rd wife and life partner, Margaret James, in 1893. Education was not all Washington impacted. His philosophy of do for self meant economically as well, believing black should acquire vocational skills to achieve economic independence rather than pushing integration and civil rights. This was showcased in his most famous speech, the Atlanta Compromise. On September 18, 1895, Booker T. Washington took the stage at the Cotton States and International Exposition in Atlanta, Georgia, in front of a packed audience of black and white people. Cast down your bucket where you are. He encouraged black Americans of the South to seek opportunities and improve their own conditions instead of migrating elsewhere in hopes of being treated fairly by white people. He implored them to develop their vocational skills and hire each other in order to build their way out of poverty and economic restraints. In all things that are purely social, We can be as separate as the fingers, yet one as the hand in all things essential to mutual progress. With this quote, Washington reiterated the importance of fighting together. To coexist separately and to try to integrate would not lead to the gains in respect and economic advancement Black people were seeking. No race can prosper till it learns that there is as much dignity in tilling a field as in writing a poem. Washington continued to promote the importance of manual and industrial labor when it came to building a solid economic foundation. Skills that were already mastered by Black people through centuries of forced labor. Washington encouraged Black people to take pride in these skills and use them as a pathway to prosperity. The wisest among my race understand that the agitation of questions of social equality is the extremest folly. Booker T. Washington believed that there was no need to advocate for integration and to force white society to accept Black people into their schools, neighborhoods, and businesses. He believed the immediate focus should be mostly on building up the Black nation, separately and without needing acceptance or permission from white people. And this could only be achieved through hard work, developing their own industries and self-reliance. This method of separatism he advocated would require patience, but would prove to be beneficial as Blacks continued to gain their footing after hundreds of years of slavery. The Atlanta Compromise speech catapulted Washington in the national spotlight. It was a polarizing address that was championed by many and challenged by just as much, and would set up a long-standing battle of philosophies with another one of the nation's Black thought leaders, W.E.B. DuBois. Washington versus DuBois. Washington's speech at the convention in Atlanta garnered him both supporters and critics. He received praise from many Black Americans, eager to do whatever was necessary to gain their independence. His speech also was well received by white leaders and philanthropists like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller, many of whom agreed that Black people's destiny laid on their shoulders and was not the burden of the mainstream society. However, W.E.B. DuBois was not one of those supporters. W.E.B. DuBois believed that the pathway to economic empowerment and racial equality was through civil rights and integration. Washington and DuBois wanted the same goal, but their philosophies stood diametrically opposed, which made sense because they themselves came from opposite ends of the Black experience. DuBois was born a free man in the North. Washington was born enslaved in the South. DuBois grew up in a predominantly white town, with some of them as neighbors and classmates. Going to school was normal. Washington grew up only knowing white folk as enslavers and overseers. He didn't see a formal classroom until he was a teenager. DuBois became the first Black person to earn a PhD from Harvard and became an advocate for higher education and professional development. Washington and his students had to literally build Tuskegee University, which reinforced his philosophy of vocational training for economic advancement. Booker T. Washington believed it was up to Black folks to self-educate and build up their own community without the help of white people. But DuBois believed that it was up to white people to allow Blacks to integrate their institutions, and that Black people needed to fight for their civil rights through gaining political power. These two warring philosophies sent waves through the Black men and women of America. Even though they never publicly debated, they sent various indirect shots at each other through their writings, speeches, and influences through leadership. The do for self and fight for civil rights ideologies of these two great men still echoed through the civil rights movement and was reincarnated through Malcolm X's by any means necessary approach versus Dr. King's fight for equality through non-violence approach. But what they would both agree on, which should never be lost, is that DuBois and Washington were always fighting for a way to bring Black people out of economic slavery. Impact and beyond. Booker T. Washington continued to advocate for the economic advancement and continuing education of Black people in America. Through his leadership at the Tuskegee Institute, he educated and helped provide vocational training for generations of Black people that led to the rise of Black communities in the South. He continued to focus directly on Black-owned businesses through different initiatives, including investing in the creation of the National Negro Business League. The National Negro Business League directly affected economic empowerment, including becoming the driving force behind the expansion of the Black middle class, and was touted as a catalyst for the development of what would become Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Beyond his impact in education and economics, Washington also served as a key political advisor to other African Americans and U.S. presidents. Booker T. Washington had a unique and influential relationship with several U.S. presidents during his lifetime. His ability to navigate political circles, especially during the era of segregation and Jim Crow laws, made him one of the most powerful black figures in American history. Washington's relationship with President Theodore Roosevelt was perhaps the most famous. In 1901, shortly after Roosevelt became president, he invited Washington to dine with him at the White House, making Washington the first African American to receive such an invitation. This event was highly controversial and sparked outrage in the South, as many whites saw the dinner as an affront to segregationist values. Washington became an unofficial advisor to Roosevelt on racial matters. Roosevelt frequently sought Washington's counsel on issues concerning the black community and political appointments involving African Americans. Washington helped secure federal positions for black Americans in the South and beyond, using his political influence to ensure their appointment to civil service jobs. His political ties continued through President Howard Taft, President William McKinley, and President Woodrow Wilson. While Booker T. Washington's relationships with U.S. presidents brought benefits to African Americans, they also drew criticism. Many black leaders, particularly DuBois, felt that Washington was too willing to compromise on issues like segregation and voting rights. They argued that his close relationships with white political leaders came at the cost of advocating for full civil rights for African Americans. But Booker T. Washington believed in the delaying of civil rights and instead continued to advocate for initiatives that led to self-sufficiency and independence, and was willing to gain allies to forward those ideals, no matter their race. The challenges that black people faced during Washington's time are not the same. However, they are still faced with questions of how to move forward, continue to integrate through civil rights in the form of DEI critical race theory, and affirmative action. Or do we adopt the ways of Booker T. Washington and continue to move forward with self-education, building your own industries, and hiring each other without focusing on what someone else can give us? In the spirit of Mr. Washington, it is our belief to continue to fight in whatever way you deem the best. But whatever you do, do it with all your might.